Welcome to the New Church Podcast.
So everything we do in life prepares us for the next thing that we have to do, our next adventure. Nobody starts finished. We have to get there step by step. Like when we're born, all we can do is just lay there and complain. But all that screaming and squirming, see, that builds up foundational strength in our muscles so that we can start crawling. Because we got to get moving, got places to go. And then crawling around, well, that builds the motor skills. Pretty soon we graduate to walking and then running. I mean, so much more mobility and confidence, right? Now it's our parents who are complaining, slow down. Walk, please. But no, we got to run. But running's not fast enough. No, so we learn how to ride a bike, which eventually makes us want the independence of driving a car. And of course, driving a car naturally leads to the universal joy of driving to Walmart in sweatpants and Crocs. So we can complain about self-checkouts and the rising price of cheese. Oh, the places you will go. Nobody starts finished. God is constantly leading us into situations that are going to shape us into the people that He wants us to be, so that we can do the things He wants us to do. Of course, some of us are slower learners than others. Some of us keep refusing to learn from our adventures. So God has to keep repeating the lessons louder and with like a little more stink on them until He finally gets through to us. All those frustrations in our life, they're all lessons. They're all opportunities to either put God's wisdom to work or fall back into our foolish ruts. God is always preparing us for our next adventure. And I think a perfect example of all these things is the way the Easter story happens in the Gospels. Let's walk through that real quick. The women were the first ones to see the empty tomb. They were the only ones to see the angels. They knew Jesus was alive, but no one believed them. And God did that on purpose. He chose them to go first because no one would believe them. Why? Because in that culture, they were the weakest witnesses. So the men, they were going to hear about the most important and glorious thing that has ever happened, and they were going to dismiss it as pure nonsense, just like God planned. But see, then the women, they see Jesus in person on the road. So their faith, man, it is as solid as it could possibly be. But the men still don't believe them. That had to be so frustrating. Stupid men, so sure of their doubt and their skepticism. See, that was a lesson for those women about how hard it was going to be to share their faith. But it was also a lesson for the men, because those same men who were so slow to believe, they were going to need to remember what it felt like to hear the gospel, hear about the resurrection, and not believe a word of it, completely dismiss it. Because they were going to spend the rest of their lives having exactly that same experience, telling people Jesus is alive, and it seems like the words just bounce off their chest and fall into the void. It was an important lesson for them. And then Jesus appears to the disciples in the house, in person, even though the women had told them He was alive, even though Peter had already seen Him alive. Yeah, they still thought He was a ghost. They didn't believe it. Not until He proved to them that it was actually Him. See, they were going to need to remember all this, what it was like when they started telling everyone else about the crucified Son of God being alive again. Remember how hard it was for them to believe, even when he was standing right there in front of them. Well, today we're going to focus on the one disciple who wasn't there when Jesus showed up in that room on Easter. Because by evening, on that day, most of the followers of Jesus had seen him for themselves, and they were completely, 100% convinced of the resurrection. All but one guy. John chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Yeah, they're all ganging up on Thomas, but he ain't having it. We need to keep in mind, though, everyone who's telling old doubting Thomas that Jesus was alive and they had seen him, none of them believed at first either. Not one of them. But okay, Thomas, he's the one who gets to have the shameful nickname of Mr. Doubt until the end of time. That seems fair. He was probably the bravest of all of them, too. Remember when Jesus said they were going to go to Bethany because Lazarus had died? It was Thomas who spoke up and said, "Sure, let's go. Let's all go to Bethany. We might as well die too." See, I like Thomas. Thomas is a bit of a cynic. Well, they're all in his face. They're all trying to convince him that Jesus has come back from the dead. They saw him with their own two eyes, but the more they push, the harder they push, the more obstinate Thomas gets in his unbelief. There's probably a lesson to be learned there, you think? Don't push too hard. Eventually, Thomas is like, "I will never believe that ludicrous story unless I see the nail marks in his hands, stick my finger in the holes, and jam my entire hand inside the gash where the spear stabbed him in the heart." Unbelief can be a little crude. It can. He probably thinks he's being logical, though, but he's not, because these are his friends. He knows they're not lying to him. They wouldn't lie to him. He knows he should trust them, but instead, he's just going to hold on to his skeptical unbelief with all the blind doubt of a fanatic. His unbelief is irrational in the face of so many reliable witnesses, but he refuses to believe. I don't know what kind of group hallucination you simple-minded idiots think you saw, but I live in the real world. Jesus is dead. I saw it. The end. Leave me alone. But I'll bet they didn't leave him alone. I'll bet they kept trying to convince him. I'll bet it became a real sore subject. You got anyone in your life, you guys, that this Jesus conversation is it's a one-way ticket to awkward? I'll bet you do. I certainly do. Well, this went on for an entire week. Verse 26. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." It's a week later. It's Sunday again. The doors are still locked, which is an interesting detail. They're still afraid of the Jewish leaders. And then suddenly Jesus pops into the room, just like he did the week before. "Shalom, peeps." Peace. Same greeting as last time. But this time, I think the peace is directed specifically to the stubborn holdout who's been arguing with everyone all week. How do you think Thomas is feeling right about now? Verse 27. Then he says to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus is like, "Hey, Thomas, I heard what you said, man. You want some proof? Well, come on. Let's make it weird." Takes off his shirt, show the spear gash. "Go ahead, get your hand in there, knucklehead." Now, see, if I'm Thomas, I do not have any need or any desire to actually touch his wounds now. Would you? It doesn't say anything about him actually doing it. Some people think he did, though, because Jesus told him to. I don't think so. Because in verse 29, Jesus is going to say to Thomas that he believed because he saw with his eyes, not because he saw and touched him. Anyway, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But Jesus says something next that I find very interesting. He says, "Do not disbelieve, but believe." Stop doubting. Stop holding on to your unbelief. Stop acting like an unbeliever. Jesus tells him to believe. Now, is there anyone here this morning that needs to hear that? Is there anyone listening to me right now, here or online, just holding on to your unbelief, your doubt, for some reason? I mean, I don't know why. It could be a lot of reasons. Maybe some Christian or some preacher hurt your feelings, or something worse. So you don't want to believe because of them. Or maybe mom and dad, maybe they were too harsh. Maybe they pushed Christianity and the church on you. They just pushed too hard, shoved it down your throat, shamed you for your sin, tried to control you with Jesus. And you're like, man, if that's all there is to this, no thank you. Or maybe you've just been like collecting little doubts, little ideas, little things people have said over the years, things that make God and faith seem unreasonable, unlikely, old-fashioned. So you just kind of keep that little collection of unbeliefs in the corner of your mind, and you bring them out anytime someone talks about Jesus, and you might be tempted to embrace faith. Well, Jesus has a message for you. In any of those situations where you're holding on to your doubt and you're not believing, Jesus has a message for you. And it's a message that's been passed down from person to person throughout the ages. It was entrusted to me this morning to give this message to you. And they went to a lot of trouble to make sure that it got to you today. So here it is. Stop disbelieving and believe. Lay down your cynicism. Set aside your skepticism. Those things are not going to give you any peace. There is no hope found in those things. Those things cannot save you. Your doubts are lying to you. You're not doing yourself any favors by ignoring God and not trusting the gospel, which is what Thomas finally realized. He had been arguing with his friends and insisting on unbelief for no good reason. And that was going to be a very important thing for Thomas to remember when he started telling people about the resurrection, when he started telling people about the hope of the gospel, when he started talking to all those belligerent people who were going to refuse to believe him. At the same time, it was really good for the rest of the disciples too, to experience what it was going to be like when a close friend, someone who should trust them, when they refuse to believe, at least for a while. This was going to teach them to be patient, to be bold, but to be gentle and never give up. Because when Thomas finally did believe, man, he really went for it. Of all the disciples who saw Jesus for who he is and believed in the resurrection, Thomas has the best response. He has the most powerful reaction because he worships Jesus. He says, "My Lord and my God." That's so good. The Gospel of John, it closes with a mirror of how it opened. Because chapter 1, verse 1 of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then after all the different things that happen, all the things that are said and done, the last disciple comes to true faith and worships Jesus and says, "My Lord and my God." And notice Jesus accepts that worship because Jesus is God. Verse 29, Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." Which is the final lesson of all these Easter appearances. This is the point. They all finally believed because of the physical evidence. Jesus teleported right in front of them. He showed them his scars. He ate with them. He spoke with them. They saw him in person. They touched him. And it was still hard for some of them to believe. So this is the lesson. They were going to have to be patient with people. They were going to need to remember what it was like to know for sure, but still have their friends think they were crazy. They were going to need to remember what it felt like to be in their shoes, skeptical, not believing a word of it. And then have Jesus show up and turn the lights on. Because when they went out into the world with this message, the gospel, it was going to be hard for people to believe, just like it was hard for them to believe. And from now on, people were going to have to believe without the kind of physical proof that they got. And Jesus says that's better. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Like all of us. Jesus says this is better. It's better this way. He says we're all blessed because we believe without seeing, purely by faith. For 2,000 years, people have been saying this. It's not seeing that makes me believe. It's believing that makes me see. Verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's why the Gospel of John and the other Gospels, that's why they were written. It's why God made sure that we have them. It's why we read them and study them and teach them, so that we can believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. And by believing in him, we can have eternal life in his name. And that's the actual end of the Gospel of John, the end of the 4 Gospels even. There is one more chapter in John. It's kind of like an epilogue. It's like one of those scenes that happens after the credits, like where Nick Fury shows up and tries to recruit Jesus for the Avengers while they eat shawarma. Except in this one, Jesus makes breakfast and tells Peter how he's going to die. More of an art film, I guess. And then the Gospel of John, it ends with that last verse again. He reiterates that last line. He says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for all the books that would be written. A lot of books. I love that he told us there were many other amazing stories that didn't get written down. But I don't understand how anything about Jesus wouldn't make the cut. You think John was writing his gospel? He's like, hey, Lazarus, you think I should include that time when Mary dropped Martha's favorite clay pot and Jesus put it back together using some spit and Matthew's solid gold wine cup? Or, hey, Peter, what do you think about me including like a whole chapter of the funniest times that you said, no, Lord, you big old oxymoron? No, Lord is an oxymoron. I'll bet there were some crazy stories. Sometimes people pick up the Bible and they're like, this thing's pretty thick. John says it could have been a lot thicker. I kind of wish it was. I wish we had more of those Jesus stories. But then again, you know, some of us haven't even read the ones we've got, right? Here's your weekly reminder of freaking and Bibles. Well, God must have thought that what he gave us was enough to get the job done, enough to give us faith so that we can be saved, and enough to pass our faith on to other people. Do you remember the first time someone shared the gospel with you? How hard was it for you to believe them? Did you believe them? How long did it take to kick in? Because it was a long time for me. My family didn't go to church, but once in a while I would stay at my friend's house and their grandma would take us to church. Nothing stuck from that I remember, but there was this other time when I was 6 or 7 years old. This lady had a tiny little VBS, a vacation Bible school, in her living room in our neighborhood. And she invited all the kids to show up. It was like free babysitting, so all our moms made us go. I don't remember much about that, but I remember cookies, cherry Kool-Aid, flannel board with some shepherds and sheep. But I also remember this. I remember her having us repeat a prayer. Something like, Jesus, forgive me of my sin, come into my life, and save me. And I think I might have been a believer for like 5 minutes after that, until the neighborhood mean girls made fun of me for not being a Christian like they are, which I didn't understand because I had eaten the cookies. I drank the Kool-Aid too. But I didn't go to church, so they figured I was a dirty, rotten pagan. Wasn't going to be until I was 14 years old, reading the Gospels in my bedroom, that I finally had my Thomas experience, from doubt to faith. What about you? What was it for you? I mean, maybe you grew up in church, so you really didn't have that moment. But there was a day when mom and dad's faith became your faith. Do you remember when that happened? Why that happened? Because it has to happen, or else we just wander around like Christian zombies. There's got to be a day when you have your own reasons for laying aside your doubts and believing instead. Faith has to become our own. We can only borrow someone else's for so long. Or maybe someone told you about Jesus, told you about how Jesus made a difference in their life and you believed. Maybe he could make a difference in yours too. Those are fun stories to listen to. And the bigger the transformation, the darker it was before the lights came on, the more powerful and glorious that story is. You know, like rock star, drug addict, porn star who give their life to Jesus. Yeah. Those are a lot of fun to listen to. But for most people, it's not that dramatic. Sometimes hearing those big epic stories actually makes us shy about telling our testimony. I mean, what's there to tell? I didn't believe, now I do. I'm thankful, but no one's going to make my life into the movie of the week. And I understand you might feel that way. But I guarantee your story is more interesting than you think it is. It might be more Seinfeld than Breaking Bad, but it's going to be powerful when you tell it to people. However God brought you to faith was your training ground. getting you ready to pass your faith on to someone else. Specific people that he has in mind for you to reach with your story because of your story. And it's never going to be easy. Remember how no one believed the women who saw the empty tomb and the angels? Remember how hard it was for the other disciples to believe even when Jesus was standing right in front of them? And stubborn Thomas, who held on to his doubt no matter what his closest friends told him. Try to remember what it took for you to finally believe. Because we all have people in our lives that we would like to see come to faith or come back to faith. I mean, we've prayed, we've had conversations. We don't know what else to do. But don't give up. Keep believing. Pray for them. Pray for God to soften their heart, to open the door for conversations. And just keep loving them. Don't argue with them. Lean into your faith. And then just trust them to God and to His mercy. You are not more merciful than God. Trust His mercy. And when you're tempted to doubt yourself, remember the disciples. It's not easy. Pray for your own faith. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Because nobody starts finished. And nobody's finished in this lifetime either. Just like you went from screaming to crawling to walking to driving to Walmart, God is making you into the person He wants you to be. All your frustrations, all your doubts, those are all training exercises. They're all part of your spiritual growth, your sanctification, not your justification. These things don't save you. See, Jesus did that part for you. That's what the resurrection's all about. That's where your faith goes. Not in your ability to figure it all out, figure out your frustrations and your doubts. So hold on to what Jesus has done for you and what He's promised you. Because the bottom line is this. It might be hard to see. You might not see it right now. Believe anyway. Jesus made you this promise. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word, we thank you for Thomas. We thank you for the promise of life and salvation in the name of Jesus. Help us, all of us here today, to overcome our skepticism, to overcome our nagging doubts. Help us to learn from God's timing and His lessons in our life so that we can trust that you are always taking us somewhere good. Help us to deal with our frustrations with patience and with self-control, to deal with the people in our life with gentleness and love. Lord, help us to trust your plan. Help us to rely on our faith rather than just the things that we can see and touch. And remind us to constantly be persistent and patient when we're sharing the gospel with people. And for anyone here, Lord, for any of the Christian zombies in the room who would call themselves Christian but are not walking in faithfulness, Lord, help them to step into their faith. Help them to make it their faith, to make it their own. Amen.
For more information, go to newchurch.love or email frank@frankhart.com.
If these online resources have been meaningful to you, please consider going to newchurch.love/give and show your support by helping make this ministry possible. Thank you.